Hello and welcome to OPA GC Sociology. This is lesson 6. What is Marxist theory? So this is continuing on and adding really a modern spin on one of the founding fathers, Karl Marx, and really looking at what Marxist theory looks like in the 20th and the 21st century. So the first activity you're going to do is you're going to try and remember those key concepts from the Karl Marx legacy lesson 3, and you're just going to fill them in and try and explain them. So it's really just filling the gaps. You can see the key words on the screen and just explaining what they are. So you might want to pause the video just for the next couple of minutes, and then we will go through each one of those. Right, so explaining each one of those, starting with the top right-hand corner, sort of the dollar sign there, it's capitalism. So that's the system that Marx is criticizing throughout his works in Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. Okay, he prefers, if we remember, and he writes a manifesto on this, communism. So capitalism's a system where sort of money and private ownership dictates everything, whereas communism is about this redistribution of wealth and making it equal in distribution. And then the one in the middle on the right is the means of production. There is the mode of production, but it's not really one of the key ones we need to know for the Marxist theory. It's really the means of production. And if we remember, like an assembly line is this idea that everyone has a specific job, and like on a car, there'll be someone working on the wheels, there'll be someone working on the engine, someone working on the suspension, and really you're one of two sides of it. You're either the person who owns the means of production or the person who does not and sells their labor essentially. So most people sell their labor, and then those who own the means of production are generally those who are the business owners, and yeah, the ones who are generally the richer. And this leads to our concepts at the bottom there, class inequality, okay, where you might have heard the expression, the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. So it's this increasing divide, this exacerbation through the means of production, where because people own the means of production, they own their companies and can essentially adjust how much profit they keep and how much they give in salaries to their employees. It's just leading to the this massive divide between rich and poor. And this leads to the concept beginning with B on the left in the middle there, the bourgeoisie. And that's those who own the means of production, i.e. those who are the ruling class or the rich. And in the top left, that's the majority of us. They're generally seen as the masses or the poor people. That's the proletariat. Right, so just a real recap really of Marx's ideas of exploitation. So Marxists talk about forces of exploitation throughout all civilization. Over time, they have changed in nature, but they all have exploitation as well as struggle at the heart of it. Just as Marx adapted his ideas of struggle, so too have traditional and neo-Marxists. So before Marx was writing, we have feudalism. So it's this idea, the struggle is between the peasants and the monarchy and their aristocracy. And then you have the industrial era. So that's what Marx is talking about with the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And then finally, we have modern capitalism, or what some might refer to as postmodern capitalism, as we're in today. Something like anywhere between the 19th to the 21st century, maybe more the 20th and 21st, where you have, if we're really simplifying it, the working class, the middle class, and the upper class. So this is the first key concept you really need to remember for the traditional Marxists, and it's capitalist superstructures. So Marxists have developed Karl Marx's ideas of class struggles to form the idea of capitalism infrastructures. Marx believed your class was determined by the means of production. Traditional Marxists agree with this, but also believe societies reinforce this rich-poor divide. Capitalist societies have superstructures that reinforce your class. So let's say, for example, your grandparents were working class. It would be various structures such as education, the political system, various values in society, a legal system, social relations, the workplace, all sorts of things, reinforcing that your father would then go on to be working class as well. And then the same things would happen to your father that would, in theory, make you working class. So it's just keeping you in your class position. Okay, so just to give an example of that, we can't really do it. It was a practical example in class. So I will just sort of really talk you through it. Or just some examples of some superstructures and how they might cause inequality. So yes, we got the education system as an example here. So in the game of life, one of the sections was students were picking up cards about their different educational experience. There was some who went to public school, i.e. private school, and some who went to state comprehensives, and some who went to grammar schools. So traditionally, private schools have a massive advantage over those who are in state comprehensives. So they tend to have class sizes that are a lot smaller. So it's easier to teach. They tend to have better cultural capital. So that's things like better vocabulary, better understanding about highbrow matters. The teachers tend to be more qualified. So they tend to be more of a specialist in their area. So you may have a teacher at state comprehensive, I'm making assumptions here, but who has got an undergraduate's, they've got their degree and then they've gone on to teach. Whereas you may at a private school have people who have a master's or a PhD in their subjects. Okay, they're at the top of their fields. There's also more resources. So it might be that they have all the textbooks, they have their own laptops, they have the best technology in classrooms to help them learn. They might also have better connections. So it might be connections in terms of knowing other people. So it might be other families of pupils who work in industries that you might want to get into. It might be that there's better connections in terms of the schools with certain workplaces, and that links into this idea of more opportunities for work as well. An example that comes to mind, I knew someone who went to a private school and they offered for one of their economics courses, something that's not really offered in a lot of state schools. They had a software that simulated the stock exchange. So it was almost like a practice software if you wanted to go into stockbroking, something that would never be heard of in a state comprehensive school. So it's just an example there of something that might be offered at one school, but not the other. So yeah, that's an example. Education is a system there that reinforces your class. Okay, if you can afford to go to private school, then generally you're going to get a bit of assumption, but you're more likely to get a better education. That also applies to, say, grammar schools and even some comprehensive schools. So, for example, generally speaking, the school you're at is a reflection of the catchment area, and it might be that the local schools in the area are more affordable or from a slightly poorer area. So therefore, you're likely to have perhaps you're likely to have students who in your school, if you're in one of those poor areas, those with lower levels of cultural capital, the class sizes might be a bit bigger. Bit presumptuous to say that the teachers might be less qualified or less resources, but often these things go hand in hand. And it's really just here, if you look at the graph, the proportion of privately educated people in the top public sector jobs. This is just public sector. Private sector would be very similar, if not worse. So the general population of those who are privately educated is 7% of the UK's population, but they make up 65% of senior judges, 59% of top civil servants, 57% of House of Lords, 29% of MPs. So you get the idea here. These are all top jobs, six-figure salaries a year. Okay, top jobs, even though the proportion of the public, or the private rather, private school population is only 7%. It's not representative. And there are other structures, so we'll just go back to them. So you could talk about the political system or legal system. So for example, tax avoidance is an example of one rule for one and one rule for another. People who can afford to move their money somewhere else aren't always taxed correctly. Okay, they might pay less tax. So there's various examples, and we're going to talk about them throughout the year. So moving on from capitalist superstructures, just a quick task for you to complete. So many critics of Marxist theory state that if these superstructures reinforce exploitation, then why doesn't the poor just constantly rebel? Okay, so I just want you to think of that and see if you can think of any examples there of why there aren't more rebellions around the world to do with capitalism. Right, so this is the next key concept, and it's referring to ruling class ideology. So if we remember the means of production, those who own things and those who don't, it's a lot more complex than that now, but there still is this hierarchy within work and with certain professions. So Marxists believe that the ruling class often prevent the working class from being aware of these exploitations or the extent of their exploitation. So it might be the case that you don't know how much your boss earns, or how hard they're working, or whether they could actually afford to pay you more in your job. Okay, so it's this whole idea of how much hypothetically could you close that class inequality, that gap between rich and poor. So how much more could you earn? How much, or how fair is the wage of those at the top? And it's the job of those at the top of society and these various superstructures to reinforce this idea that everyone deserves what they earn, and we shouldn't really talk about money. So really just to reinforce this, the figures may or be here or thereabouts, but they're roughly right. So the average wage in the UK works out to about 31,000 a year. It works out roughly about 16 hours per hour. Now, obviously, that's assuming it's a 8-hour working day and you're working 5 days a week. Okay, compare that to Mo Salah, famous footballer for Liverpool. I think recently they announced he gets loads more money than this, in fact, in advertisements. But this was based on his salary paid by Liverpool Football Club, and it worked out something like 9.6 million per year. And just within that hour, look at that massive rise. So the rise from the average of 16 odd pounds to 5,000 pounds per an hour. And then we've got Jeff Bezos. Everyone really knows who Jeff Bezos is. Recently been into space, owner of Amazon. He might have stepped down. You get the point. He's made loads of money off of Amazon, and this was based on the figures he was on average earning during the lockdown. So his estimated worth was something along the lines of 107 billion. I heard a lot more. I heard as much as 200 billion. So this is quite a conservative guess. But it works out to roughly 40 million per an hour. So look at these astonishing gaps. And there's a video link here where it's just illustrating this rich-poor divide, where you can see the difference between a millionaire to Jeff Bezos. Okay, So just look at the different scales if you have an opportunity to type in that link onto YouTube. And just really some more reinforcements, some stats that are going to help to reinforce this rich-poor divide. So the Office of National Statistics published this 2018. So the top 10% are own 45% of the UK's wealth. So if you look at the bottom there, you can see how much wealth they've got in terms of pensions, in terms of just financial wealth, physical wealth. So that might be your like assets, like your houses and things like that. And compare that to the bottom 10% right at the top there. It's a massive difference. Even comparing the top 50% compared to the bottom 50%, there's a massive gap. And then really this final concept here for the traditional Marxists. So we've had capitalist superstructures, we've had ruling class ideology. We're now coming on to the final one, which is false consciousness. Okay, so just for task 3, you're just going to state whether you agree with the ideas of the ruling class ideology and false consciousness. So this final one, false consciousness, just to be clear, Marxists believe that capitalist societies mislead the people to think society is equal and meritocracy works. So they lead people to believe that if you're in a top job earning top wages, that's because you've worked really hard, you're very talented, and you're just a right fit for that job. Okay, you deserve every penny of what you get. So if you work hard, you go to school, go to college, then university perhaps, get some work experience, then you'll end up at the top job. Okay, and if you're not in that top job, then that's perhaps a reflection of your skills, your efforts, that sort of thing. That's what meritocracy is at the heart of it. This idea of the American dream, you might have heard it as well. But Marxists argue this is false. So it's made to look like that, but the reality is there's lots of these capitalist structures getting in the way of that. So things like, for example, education, okay, the type of school you go to, or whether you can afford to go to university, whether you're able to match people and compete with others in higher classes going for jobs. Okay, so things like this, it's not truly a reflection of the individual's merits and attributes and hard work. It's more a reflection of the structures limiting the working classes. So finally, moving on to the Marxist critique. So there are some positives with the Marxist theory. So it does consider class and how class can impact your life chances. It does consider social inequalities, therefore. Traditional Marxist theory has also impacted things like political policies in welfare and the healthcare system. So although the idea of the NHS is socialist, socialism does have some elements that overlap with communism. Not fully, but some elements. So this idea that money doesn't come first when we're thinking about the National Health Service. Okay, it's making sure that everyone has access to it. But there are some negatives as well. So yes, it's great in terms of looking at certain social inequalities, such as class, but it does neglect some of the other main ones like race and gender and age. It's also quite deterministic, and this is a critique you would have seen quite a lot of the theories that are structuralist. So it's this idea that it doesn't really consider the individual's free will. So there are going to be people who defy the odds, who are working class, who don't believe in this idea of false consciousness and aren't limited by those capitalist structures. Okay, so perhaps someone who's really poor who does go on to be a billionaire or something like that. Also, there's been in the past failures of communism, which is really that utopia for many Marxists. We've had failures in China, for example, with Mao Zedong, with failures in Russia with the Soviet Union and people like Stalin. And there's not really this big presence of communism around the world. Right, so that was traditional Marxist theory. In the next lesson, we're going to be looking at feminist theory or interactionism. Thank you.